The world has long been preoccupied with the strategic pressure exerted by two nuclear autocracies. On one side, Vladimir Putin has been promoting the narrative of nuclear invincibility in recent months. The propaganda machine was running at full throttle. As recently as November 4, 2025, Putin appeared before the cameras and, calling it a matter of historic importance, showered state awards on those who signed off on two terrifying weapons allegedly designed to penetrate U.S. missile defense systems. The Burevestnik cruise missile claimed to have unlimited range, and the Doomsday torpedo Poseidon. This was seen as a continuation of the shock created by the Oreshnik hypersonic missile, the so-called doctrine killer, which was allegedly tested in Ukraine. Putin believed he had shattered the West's defensive shield. But Putin was not the only power shaking the nuclear blackmail cage. Simultaneously in Beijing, Xi Jinping's administration was quietly pursuing perhaps the fastest nuclear buildup in history. The reports from the Federation of American Scientists were clear. China was locked into a target of over 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030. This was the doctrine of saturation. In other words, they aimed to launch so many missiles, such as the DF-5C and DF-41, that the U.S. defense systems would be unable to stop them all at once. Moscow believed its invincible hypersonic weapons and Beijing its unstoppable numerical superiority had cornered the West. So Putin was savoring the taste of propaganda victory. Beijing, meanwhile, was converting its economic power into nuclear power. Both believed the U.S. had weakened and dropped its guard. However, the lifespan of this nuclear bluff, this arrogant victory euphoria, ended just 24 hours after Putin's award ceremony. On the morning of November 5, 2025, at 1:35 Pacific Time, a button was pressed at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. The U.S. Air Force Global Strike Command launched an LGM-30G Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile. The Minuteman III missile lit up the Pacific skies. This launch was announced as a routine operational test. However, the Minuteman was not routine, but rather the weapon that marked the beginning of a new and dangerous era. This launch coincided with a period in which Russia boasted of penetrating Western air defenses using its Oreshnik missile, which it claimed reached Mach 10 speeds over Ukraine, and China threatened the U.S. with a saturation attack targeting over 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030. This test was seen as an ultimatum sent directly to Moscow and Beijing in the global media arena. However, the real strategic move was not the missile itself, which was based on 1970s technology, but the method of launch. This missile was triggered not from a land silo, but from an E-6B Mercury aircraft, i.e. the Air Launch Control System, ALCS. This was the message that retaliation would come from the air, even if you destroyed your land-based command centers. Putin and Xi's dream of a first strike was dashed by this single test. This was the first move in a new three-way nuclear chaos, where arms control agreements have effectively collapsed. The technical details of this strategic show of force reveal the gravity of the situation. Codenamed Glory Trip 254, this operation, as its name suggests, was more than a routine system check for the U.S. Air Force Global Strike Command. It was a victory lap. The launch took place at 1:35 a.m. Pacific Time, in the darkness of night, from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. However, the nerve center of this test was not the launch pad, but an invisible command station in the sky. The focus of this test was not so much the LGM-30G Minuteman III missile itself, which dates back to the 1970s, but rather the system that fires it, the Air Launch Control System, or ALCS. This system is the most flexible and vital second strike guarantee in the U.S. nuclear command structure. First, we need to clarify what ALCS means. This system ensures that nuclear retaliation orders can be issued from the air, even if all of the U.S.'s ground-based command centers, such as Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska or NORAD at Cheyenne Mountain, are destroyed by an enemy attack, such as Russia's Oreshnik or China's DF-41 missiles. This is where the process becomes critical on November 5th. An E-6B Mercury aircraft, built on a Boeing 707 platform and known as the Doomsday Plane, belonging to the U.S. Navy, was in a designated holding position over the Pacific. This aircraft carries out the take charge and move out mission. During the GT-254 test, ground-based launch control centers were taken offline by a simulated enemy attack. The retaliation order was transmitted directly by the operational team aboard the E-6B Mercury aircraft, using ultra-high frequency UHF radio signals to the Minuteman III missile brought from F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming and placed in the silo at Vandenberg. The missile was launched by this command from the air. This is not like pressing a button from an ordinary silo. It is an extremely complex exercise proving that the chain of command will not break even in the most chaotic scenario of a nuclear war. Of course, the missile's trajectory is also important. The missile did not carry a warhead. Instead, it carried a re-entry vehicle containing numerous telemetry and sensor packages monitored by the 576 Flight Test Squadron. After exiting the atmosphere and flying for approximately 30 minutes, this vehicle reached its target 6,760 kilometers, or approximately 4,200 miles, away, Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean, also known as the Reagan Test Range. The choice of this target was not accidental. Kwajalein Atoll is home to the U.S.'s most advanced radar and tracking systems, such as the Space Fence. Confirming that the 50-year-old Minuteman III could still find its target without missing by an inch after a flight of thousands of kilometers was critical to proving the missile's accuracy and reliability. AFGSC Commander General Thomas Boussier's statement clarified the purpose of the test. Boussier said that these test launches are critical to demonstrating to our nation and our allies that our nuclear deterrent is safe, secure, reliable, and effective. However, between the lines of this statement, the real message was directed at Moscow and Beijing. Meanwhile, the GT-254 test conducted by the U.S. on November 5th was not an isolated show of force or a technical trial. It was a cool-headed and calculated response to a series of aggressive moves on the nuclear chessboard over the past 12 months that have shaken the geopolitical balance. The timing of this test was the final link in a chain of provocations. It was the result of a dangerous game initiated by Russia and China. The first crack in this timeline occurred in November 2024, with an attack on a target in the Ukrainian city of Dnipro. That day, Russia used a new missile called Oreshnik, which had not been heard of before. Western intelligence services and OSINT analysts quickly determined that this attack was not ordinary. Oreshnik was reportedly a hypersonic weapon capable of reaching Mach 10, or 10 times the speed of sound, and carrying 6 separate warheads. This was likely a system derived from the RS-26 Rubezh project. Oreshnik's strategic significance was more alarming than its technical specifications. This weapon was designed to penetrate all existing Western air defense systems, including Patriot PAC-3 and THAAD. The response time of Patriot systems was insufficient to counter the maneuvers of a missile traveling at such speeds. By using Oreshnik in Ukraine, Putin sought to send a message to the world, particularly to Washington. This move instantly called into question the entire Western air defense architecture and was an attempt to upset the nuclear balance in Russia's favor. The second and direct trigger in this domino effect occurred just 24 hours before the test in the U.S., on November 4, 2025. Vladimir Putin held a grand ceremony at the Kremlin. At this ceremony, state awards were presented to the developers of 2 exotic nuclear weapons that Russia called invincible. These weapons were the Burevestnik cruise missile, powered by nuclear energy and theoretically capable of unlimited range, and the Poseidon nuclear-powered autonomous torpedo, designed to create mega tsunamis in coastal cities. By distributing these awards, Putin took the invincibility propaganda he started with Oreshnik to its peak. The message was clear. Not only can I penetrate your defenses, but I also possess weapons that can circle the planet for weeks and destroy your coastlines. This was an open challenge to the U.S. Simultaneously, China, the third player in the equation, had embarked on a quiet but far more extensive buildup. The bipolar structure of the Cold War was effectively dead. The Federation of American Scientists and the Pentagon's 2024 and 2025 annual reports on China confirmed a radical change in Beijing's nuclear strategy. China has abandoned its minimum deterrence doctrine and launched an aggressive modernization drive, aiming for 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030 and more than 1,500 by 2035. China's strategy was not just about numerical growth, but also about developing a saturation strike capability. New ICBMs such as the DF-5C, DF-31AG, and the solid-fueled, mobile DF-41 were designed to overwhelm the U.S. ground-based mid-course defense anti-ballistic missile system in Alaska and California with more decoys and real warheads than it could intercept. Amid all this, the last diplomatic lifeline had snapped. President Trump's order to end the global nuclear test moratorium that had been in place since 1992 and to immediately begin testing, citing Russia's activity at its Novaya Zemlya test site, confirmed by satellite imagery, and China's rapid buildup, drove the final nail into the coffin of the arms control regime. The Minuteman III test on November 5th was the first response, the first warning shot of this chaotic, unruly, and multipolar new nuclear era. In fact, the significance of the November 5th GT-254 test lies not so much in the technical success of the missile launched, but in its refutation of an assumption embedded in the foundations of Russia's and China's nuclear strategies. This test was a move that reaffirmed the doctrine of mutual assured destruction, the cornerstone of nuclear deterrence. To understand this ripple effect, it is necessary to distinguish between two fundamental concepts of modern nuclear strategy: first strike and second strike capabilities. First strike is a strategy to win a nuclear war by destroying all of the enemy's command and control centers and nuclear weapons, bombers, and submarines before they can respond. This is an extremely destabilizing and dangerous fantasy. Second strike, on the other hand, is the guarantee that a country can retaliate with its surviving weapons and destroy its enemy, even if it is subjected to the most destructive first strike. What preserved peace during the Cold War was the knowledge that both sides, the US and the USSR, possessed a guaranteed second strike capability. Russia and China's recent moves were aimed at upsetting this balance. Putin's multi-billion-dollar investment in weapons he calls invincible, such as Oreshnik, Vandenberg, and the heavy ICBM Sarmat, had a single strategic goal: to paralyze the US's second strike capability before a retaliation order could even be given. Russian doctrine was based on the assumption that these hypersonic weapons could bypass US radar and defense systems, obliterating command centers and Minuteman III silos in seconds. By testing Oreshnik in Ukraine, Putin sought to prove that this first strike capability was no longer theoretical, but a practical threat. China's 1,000-plus warhead target was another version of the same first strike fantasy. Beijing's strategy was to overwhelm the US GMD system by launching 10 to 15 decoys and real warheads for each anti-missile, thereby breaching the defense and striking command centers. The November 5th ALCS test directly targeted and debunked this Russian first strike fantasy and China's saturation strategy. The message the US sent with this test was brutally clear. You can destroy all our land-based command centers. You can hit all 400 of our Minuteman III silos in Wyoming, Montana, and North Dakota. But as long as our E-6B Mercury Doomsday planes are in the air, and these planes are on 24/7 rotation, the retaliation order will be given from the air, and the missiles will be fired if they have not been shot down. Furthermore, there is also a naval component to this doctrine. The U.S. Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines, or SSSBNs, patrol silently in the depths of the oceans and cannot be detected. The ALCS test demonstrated not only the command flexibility of one leg of the nuclear triad, but also the overall survivability of the E-6B, which can send launch orders to submarines. This was a move that strategically nullified Putin's billion-dollar investment in hypersonic technology and China's numerical superiority. Russia and China could not eliminate the US's second strike guarantee. The second-wave impact of this test is that it shows 50-year-old Minuteman III technology is still valid. Russian and Chinese propaganda, and even some Western analysts, presented the US's reliance on these missiles dating back to the 1970s as a weakness. However, the GT-254 test proved that this 50-year-old missile can still hit a target 6,760 kilometers away with high accuracy. This was a reminder to Moscow and Beijing. The Minuteman III test on November 5th was less a single military event and more a funeral march, announcing the effective death of the entire arms control architecture that has maintained global stability since the Cold War. The bigger picture is not so much the missiles themselves, but the wreckage of the agreements that limited them and the dangerous three-polar nuclear chaos era beginning amid this wreckage. This is the inevitable outcome of a series of diplomatic collapses. The first and most important domino in this collapse is the effective death of New START, the last nuclear agreement between the US and Russia. This agreement limited both countries to 1,550 deployed strategic nuclear warheads and 700 delivery vehicles, ICBMs, SLBMs, and bombers. However, this agreement expires in February 2026. Russia suspended the agreement's verification mechanisms in 2023, citing the war in Ukraine as justification. Putin offered to extend the agreement without verification. This was seen as a trap and a diplomatic maneuver that rendered the agreement meaningless. Without verification, New START is nothing more than a piece of paper with dried ink. More importantly, New START covered threats that did not exist when it was signed in 2010. Exotic systems such as Oreshnik, Vandenberg, Burevestnik, and Poseidon, which are Putin's invincible weapons, are outside the scope of this agreement. While Putin pretended to comply with the agreement technically, he undermined its spirit with new and destabilizing technologies. This situation placed the November 5th test in an environment where agreements are dead and only raw military signals remain. The second domino had already fallen with the collapse of the 1987 INF Treaty in 2019. Russia's violation of the treaty with its 9M729 missile and the US's subsequent withdrawal paved the way for the redeployment of both conventional and nuclear intermediate-range missiles in Europe. This created instability that directly threatens European security. The third and final domino is the collapse of the nuclear test ban. Although the 1996 Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty never entered into force, since 1992 there had been a de facto moratorium on explosive nuclear testing among the major powers, with the exception of North Korea. President Trump's order to immediately begin testing on November 1, 2025, shattered this 30-year global norm. This decision coincided with Russia's withdrawal of its signature from the CTBT and preparations at its test site on Novaya Zemlya. The return of explosive testing will replace computer simulations and pave the way for countries to design new, smaller, more usable warheads. However, the most dangerous factor in the bigger picture is China, the third player in the equation. The Cold War, due to the bipolar US-USSR structure, however dangerous it was predictable. Today's world is seen as a three-polar US-Russia-China nuclear chaos. This makes strategic stability nearly impossible, like a three-body problem. An analysis by the Union of Concerned Scientists revealed who would be the biggest winner in this new test race. The US has conducted over 1,030 tests, and Russia over 715 tests in the past, accumulating a massive amount of data. China, however, has conducted only 45 tests, which is very few. Therefore, China is seen as the country that will gain the most technical knowledge and new warhead design data from a new explosive test race. So while the US and Russia engage in a dangerous nuclear arm wrestling match over Ukraine and Europe, this fight is most beneficial to China, which has quietly increased its arsenal to 1,500 warheads and is hungry for new test data to modernize its nuclear technology. However, despite China's threats, the missile launched from Vandenberg on November 5th was not just carrying a telemetry device, it was carrying a strategic ultimatum to Moscow and Beijing. Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping believed they had redrawn the nuclear chessboard with over 1,000 warheads and undermined the US's first strike doctrine. However, by firing a 50-year-old missile from a Doomsday Plane, the US reminded them of a second strike doctrine that dashed these first strike dreams and confirmed mutually assured destruction. This was not a routine test, but a dangerous, unrestrained, and new nuclear arms race ignited by three nuclear powers playing on the wreckage of arms control agreements. Thank you for watching.